All right, if you're here to learn how to build Rally apps and extend our platform with JavaScript, you are in the right spot. In this video, we're going to refactor the grid code from the prior two videos. Now, we're not going to add any new features. Rather, we're going to refactor the code and make the code cleaner, easier to test, and maintain and debug. And we'll use some patterns that you'll see when you're looking at other apps that are out and available on the internet. My name is David Thomas. I'm a systems engineer in the sales team here at Rally Software. One thing that's interesting that happened here in my hometown of Santa Cruz is a few weeks ago I actually saw a whale alive, swimming, from the shore, just a few hundred feet offshore. I used to think that you'd have to be out in a boat, out in the deep ocean to see those things, but got to see this wonderful, magical creature just a few hundred feet offshore. It's pretty neat. So let's review our purpose. So as a Rally customer, you want to be comfortable extending the Rally platform to provide your business with unique insights into your own data. And as part of the acceptance criteria for these videos, we're going to focus on the first one today, being able to know where to find existing apps so you can get some examples for source code and be able to navigate the patterns that you see in that source code. We're also going to focus on the last two bullets, again, being comfortable trying, failing, and debugging and learning while coding with apps. And also, now that this will be the third video of coding, as you should start to see a pattern in yourself of feeling like this isn't that bad actually, right? I'm starting to understand the patterns in the code, and now I'm starting to see all the possibilities of what I can do with this platform. So as a quick reminder, on the left in the screenshot, you'll see the basic grid. This is from the first grid video, just a basic list of stories. The second video, what we did is we refactored it and to show a list of defects that the user could filter based on two pull-downs, iteration and severity. And that's the grid that we're going to focus on today, but we're going to refactor it at the code level. So here's a list of things that we're going to focus on. First, we're going to refactor the query filters and use an actual filter object. And they'll show you how you can use anding and oring a lot easier, rather than just an array of filter objects. The second thing we'll do is we're going to focus on using XJS's mechanism of IDs to identify components and look them up, rather than shoving the components up at the app level and always referencing them sort of globally. Just another way to do it. The third thing we're going to do is we're going to define a layout at the app level. So rather than sort of defining containers and adding components to containers deep in the code and not really having a holistic sense of what the app looks like, I'm going to show you a way that you can define that a little higher up in the app. The fourth thing we'll cover are event handlers, and you'll see some patterns for how to cleanly register your event handlers, define the functions, and also call them in a way that's you don't have sort of a bunch of logic and code deeply nested in your app. And then the last thing is we're going to tackle our good old friend's scope, and I'll show you a pattern that you see that'll make it a little bit easier when you're looking through code to get a sense of what the this variable points to. So the first thing I want to start out with is the basis for the patterns I'm going to show you. I'm not making them up. Many of them, all of them, really, are coming from examples of code that exists. And especially as you're learning how to build on our platform, or even as you have experience, which you do now after watching several videos, is you want to see some examples of what other people are building and how they build it. So there are three places you can go to get good examples. The first place is the official Rally app catalog that's out on GitHub. It's github.com/rallyapps, and I'll show you an example there in a second. The next one is Rally Community, github.com/rallycommunity, and these are apps that you yourself and others, other Rally customers, have contributed back to the community. And the third is the Rally Hackathon, and this is where at the Rally-sponsored customer hackathons or some of our internal hackathons, we put up our code. And across all three, the basic idea is, in terms of level of maturity, that the code, and testability and all that good stuff is the code that's in the Rally apps. Those are officially supported apps, and you get all the support, and you can trust them for what that's worth. The apps that are in the Rally community, right? It's a community of trust. So we're hoping and we're expecting that people that put apps up there, they've tested them at least on the major browsers. They don't have a bunch of debugging code just spewing out that they actually work and they do something useful, right? There's a sort of community of trust there. Now, the apps in the Rally Hackathon, those are going to be, we only have 2 days to code. So I typically see that repository as great for good snippets of code or good examples. But it's definitely, it's going to be hit or miss whether you want to drop that in and expect the results to be what you want. So with that, let's get coding. So let's start off by taking a look at an example of some code with the patterns that we're going to talk about here. So I'm going to go to the Rally Apps GitHub repository. There are a lot of repositories in here: defect summary matrix, storyboard, etc. I'm going to go into this new one here, relatively new one, called the app catalog. And if you look in here, if you scroll down in the documentation, you'll see here are the list of apps in our catalog, in the Rally catalog, the official catalog, by name, and they link to the actual help page within Rally, and then they also have the link to the source code in GitHub. So I'm going to go down, let's say, for example, we're interested in the Kanban board, right? So if you click on Kanban board, that'll bring you to the Rally help and give you screenshots and describe what it is and how to use it and all that good stuff. But for the purposes of code, I want to come into the source. So here's the source code for the Kanban app. The entry file is going to be kanban app.js. And most of these have the app.js in the end. That's sort of the entry point. There's going to be a lot more code and examples and patterns in here that we're not used to yet. But let's just kind of sniff through this and see what we see and what makes sense here, right? So here we have, in this case, they're defining an app, and they're extending Rally app. And that's exactly what our apps do. Okay, so this is the official, the app. If we scroll down, we'll see here's line 51. Here's our launch function that we're familiar with, right? So this is going to be what it does to kick things off. Now, we can go through and take a look. Here's another pattern, the underscore in the front, right? Sort of indicating their internal private method, so to speak. We'll see the this variable being used. So those are the things that we're used to. Let me scroll back up to the top and I'll sniff out a couple things that we're going to talk about today. One is this items array. We're going to define our items, sort of the layout of our app up top. You also see X-type. We're going to talk about X-type in our refactored app. If we scroll down, we'll see things like, let's see what's another good. Here's one. This dot down. So we're going to be using the X item IDs to find our components and containers by an identifier. We're going to search for them and get their references rather than up at the app level like we used earlier. And then let's see, is there anything else that's interesting in here worth mentioning? And here's another good example, listeners. We're going to talk about this too, event handlers. In this listeners block, notice here's the name of the listener and the value, the function that's going to be called. So when this object, which is the Rally cardboard, when it loads, it's going to call onboard load. Now, in our examples, we would actually define the function in here and have all the logic, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see here in this really nice tight example in their listeners block, they very simply define the 5 listeners and the 5 methods that we're going to get invoked when those events happen. And of course, passing scope up to throw in the reference to the app up in there. So it's nice, really tight example there. And I think, I don't think I have an example of the me with the this. I don't. Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. But here's one really good example, this Kanban app.js, of many of the patterns that we're going to talk about today. So I'm not making it up. All right, to kick things off, we're going to focus on number 1, query filters, refactoring them. So in order to refactor code, we need to get the code. What code do we want? So if we go down to github.com, Rally community, getting started, this is the code in session 4. This is the last session that we're going to build upon, right? So we want to get the code for this interactive grid. So what I'm going to do is this is currently in Rally community. I want a copy of this code so I can make my changes to it. So from GitHub, I'm going to go up to fork. I'm going to fork this into my personal repository. And here you can see now I have David P. Thomas getting started. And then down here in the lower right is the URL to clone. So that's the code I'm going to get. So I'll go to a new tab. Now as I said before, when I start to develop apps, I like to start in the developer.rallydev.com. I like to open up my SDK docs, come in and open up my terminal. I'll go to a good location here and do git clone and paste in the David P. Thomas getting started to Git. So here I have my source code. I'm interested in session 4. And here there's an interactive grid, and here's the source code for that. So I'll go ahead and open up my app debug. That'll give me a new terminal with the actual code. Now I'm already logged into Rally in this browser, so it didn't ask me, but it'll ask you for your credentials. That's all good. So don't be alarmed when you see that. And then just to wrap things up, I'll open up my dev console, my debug console. Okay, so we have source code. Let's get focused on changing the query filters. So what exactly are we going to change? If you go into the SDK, if you look in the components that are available, the Rally components, there's one here called Rally Data Wasapi Filter. And in here, this is a filter object that supports the and or queries. So when you're going to a data store and you want to filter, and these are stores that go to Rally to fetch data, you're going to send those filters to Rally. And those filters can be fairly complex, right? You want to get stories or defects or test cases that match iterations this, and I want severity this, or I want it to be like blocked, right? So you can have these combinations of AND and OR values. So here's an example. It looks pretty simple, right? Just x.create, so create an object of this type, of Wasapi filter type, and you give it some configuration, which looks familiar to the recent ones we had, which is the property, like in this case, name equals is the operator, and the value is some string. And notice also there's this convenience method called toString, which will spit out the filter in the web service API format with parentheses around that. And that'll be, you'll see that, we'll do that a couple times in our examples. So let's go into our code. Let's see, app.js. Now I'm assuming you've watched the prior video, so you understand the layout, the gist of all the code that's in here. But just as a quick example, right? So we have our app, we're extending Rally app, so we get all that infrastructure for free. We have our launch function. Let's see, we created a container for our 2 pull downs that's empty at this point. We load our iterations. Loading the iterations, in this method, this created a combo box for the pull down. When that was ready in our listeners, we called load severities. Load severities is also a combo box, and it's of defect severities, and when it was ready, we called load data. And then in load data, down below, we pulled out the values from those 2 pull down boxes. We created some filters with those values, and we dealt with creating a store and giving those filters to the store. And then of course, once the store loaded, we went and created a grid to show them. Okay, so what we're going to focus on right now is just the filtering part. We're going to refactor this little filter part here, this guy. Now the way that it's written, it's a simple basic JavaScript array. It's an array of 2 objects. Now the way that it's defined, if you put these objects in here, Rally's going to assume you're going to AND them together. So you don't have much control over the complexities of ANDing and ORing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this. We're going to use the example. We'll use the example from up above here. Some more room. Okay. So we're going to say var. We'll do the first one, the iteration filter. Iteration filter is equal to x.create rally.data.wasapi.filter. Give it a configuration object. And based on the example above, it's actually the 3 that are down here. So we'll go and copy those 3, put them up there. Okay. Let's do the same thing with severity. So we'll say severity filter, severity filter. Okay. Close that off, and then we'll grab the 3. config options there. Okay, and get rid of our old filters. So what do we have here? Well, we have 3 filter objects. So let's take a look at it. Console.log, iteration filter, iteration filter. We'll put in the value, just spit it out to the debug log, iteration filter. And we'll also do another one, which is the that toString. As you'll see, that'll become really handy. So let's go and take a look at Command 2, Command R, and reload our app. Down below, I'm looking for a debug for the iteration filter. We can ignore the error because that's we changed the filter, so that's the code down below. But what I'm interested in right now is just this iteration filter. So we can see we have this object, which is a filter object. You can dig into that if you want. But what I'm also interested in is on the far right over here, you can see the actual spit out of our toString, which is iteration equals that little that unique reference to the iteration. Let's go back to our code. So what's important now is now that we have individual filters, how do we combine them together? Let's go up to the docs. I don't know if there's a good example up in the docs. There's actually not. But if you look under methods, there is an AND method and an OR method. So let's take a look at AND, for example. Oh, here's the example. So you can actually say, you can create a filter, and then you can say, I want to take that filter, which I've just created, and AND it with a second filter. Now they inline created this filter here, but we've already created them individually, so we'll just do AND together. So what we're going to do is we're going to say var combo filter is equal to the iteration filter and the severity filter. Okay, and then we'll combo filter, let's spit this out. Actually, we don't have to print out the whole object. Let's just print out the toString for now. Command 2, Command R. We're just looking for the output. It will error, that's okay. So here you can see combo filter, and now look at this magic that's going on here. We have this very cool web service API formatted query string where I'm taking one value and I'm ANDing it to another value. Now, so far that's fairly simple, and so you might wonder, well, why am I using these query filters? Well, let's go and add one more quick example. Let's say we had a third one called blocked. So we say a blocked equals, let's say true. Okay. And now we're going to say our blocked filter is equal to, or let's say my filters is equal to blocked filter dot or combo filter. Right. So we're going to want things that are blocked, or we want things that are for a particular iteration and severity. That's a little contrived, but I just want to get an example here. So let's say my filters, Command 2, Command R. So we have 3 filters that we're applying in different combination. Oh, my filter not defined. What did I do here? My filters. Got an S. And so now if you look under my filter, we've got this nice long string here that's going to be center rally. When you start getting pretty complex with, of course, 3 or 4 or 5 or more of these query filters, obviously you don't want to be doing it by hand. And you want the query filter logic to do all the right ANDing and ORing and also get the parentheses correct, which is the big trick. Okay, so here I'm saying blocked is true. Let's see, get the parentheses right. Blocked is true, or this whole combination, okay, or those two things. All right, so that's where this stuff comes in handy. Now I'm actually going to get rid of the block because that was contrived. I'm not adding features. And let's just get back to using our iteration and severity ANDed together. So we'll call it var my filters. I'm calling that because that's the variable we use down below, is equal to the iteration filter and the severity filter. I'll leave that in there. And then we have this my filters, which down below in the store creation, we called filters my filters. And you can just pass in that query filter object and it will go and get the right string out. Whereas before it was an array of things. So the store's filter mechanism is actually fairly smart. Command 2, Command R. And now we should have Up above, you can see it's filtered. We should be able to choose like major. And now we have, here you can see down below under my filter, this particular iteration and severity equals major. Let's go choose minor. Here we go. This iteration, severity minor. Okay. So that's an example of how we refactored our code very simply using an official filter object, this Rally Data Wasapi filter. And by doing that, you're able to get the anding and oring, and you can pass those right to the store, and it keeps our code cleaner and easier to debug and test. Now I'd like to take one extra second and take this a step further with our filters. Notice in our load data method, we're doing our filter logic. If you go down below, we're doing our store logic, etc. And it's getting kind of heavy. It's feeling heavy. So what I want to do just briefly is I want to pull the filter logic out into its separate method. Okay. So up above, I'll create a method called get filters. It's a function. I don't know if I'm passing anything to it yet, but we'll just we'll say nothing at the moment. And what get filters is going to do is we're going to replace this line here. It'll say var my filters equals this dot get filters. And hopefully that's going to do all of this logic for us. So let's go pull. We can get rid of, let's see, what do we want? We want all of the logic here that's filter specific. Let's cut that out and paste it in. So a couple things here is we're going to return. So we'll create an iteration filter, create a severity filter, and return the anding of the two. Now what's missing, of course, is that we need the values, the actual physical values. So let's have those passed in. So we'll call it iteration value and severity value, in which case we refactor these variables to be iteration value and severity value. Okay, of course, a little more commenting here. So construct the filters for defects given iteration severity values. Okay. Well, actually make a note here. I'm probably expecting a ref of the iteration. Okay, so that's that. So we have to call it. So here's our new get filters method, but we have to pass in the selected iterref and the selected severity value that we plucked out up above. We'll leave our, actually let's get rid of this console. It's kind of redundant if we're going to stick in the filter, the value of the filter. So if we see the filter looking good, then we know the selected values are good. So this is it. We took that whole chunk and we boiled it down to these just a couple lines here. So when we call load data will go get the values from the pull downs, pass them into a convenience function that will do all the filtering magic and give us back a filter object. And we'll spit that out. And we see here, if I just do it in one example, major, we still have the my filter, and it's giving us a nice big filter string. So the reason I like this in particular is we could have left it the way it was, but the reason I like the way that we did it in this particular case is obviously the filtering stuff is encapsulated. When you're doing a testing of code, like automated testing, you can call a simple method on this called get filters. You give it two values, and it will spit you back an object that you can test against. One thing I intentionally did not do is I did not put these two lines where we went to the combo boxes and we got the values that were selected. I did not put that code up into the filter code. Why? Because that means I'm tightly coupling filter logic with accessing things about the app. I don't want this method to know anything about the app other than give me two simple pieces of data, I'll spit you out a new object. If I put the combo boxes in there during automated testing, I'd have to make sure those combo boxes were even available, right? But if I'm just doing simple unit testing methods, I don't want to have dependencies on things that I may not have control over. So that's why I did just a simple pass in the value here. Okay, one little nice little refactoring. All right, so let's move on to the second thing in our refactor list, ext IDs. So the basic idea here is that whenever you create a component, any component in Next, you can give it an ID. And there are two types of IDs. Now I'm going to take a quick aside here and let you know it took me a couple of months to really get my head wrapped around, like, why would you use one version of an IDE versus an ID versus a different version of an ID, and what are the pros and cons and benefits? And like, I just had to like surf through enough code, make enough mistakes. I'm going to boil it down right now. Every component, you can create an ID attribute, give it a name. That is a unique name across the entire app. There's also a second thing called an item ID. This is not unique. This is an ID that's relative to the container that the component is in. So for example, if you have a pull-down that you want to reuse, you call it the severity pull-down. And that pull-down in a very large app happens to be used in two different places. Well, you can give it the same item ID, but when you query for it, the queries are relative. So in one part of the app, when you say, hey, give me the severity pull-down, it'll go like, oh yeah, I found it over here. And if you're in the other part of the app, when the user clicks on something and say, hey, go get me the severity pull-down, it's like, oh, it looks kind of locally, and it's like, oh yeah, I found it over here. And so the item IDs are an internal Xthing reference that lets you find components within containers. And as I mentioned in tip number 1 in one of the very early videos about Xed containers and components, you might build sort of this hierarchical nesting of one container inside of another, and you have a bunch of components, and some of those components are containers. You create these hierarchical trees. Well, the item ID lets you do sort of local searches, whereas the ID physically is a global search. So let's take a look. At some examples. So one of the things that we've been using was the iteration combo box, the pull down for iterations. Now, all of these in the configs, there's a lot of configs. Actually, let's just filter. I'll put ID. And you can see in the configs, two things show up that are of interest. One is this one called ID, and there's also this one called item ID, right? ID is global. There's only one. For that name, you can only have one for the entire app. With item ID, you can it does not have to be unique. But let's click on ID. And you can just see, I'm not going to read through all this, but you can see it says the unique ID of this instance. And then right below it says, instead of using assigned IDs, use the item ID config. And then use the component query, which provides a selector-based searching. So they're already talking about searching locally, if you will. And then it says here, the container class contains shortcut methods to query the descendant components. That's kind of the relative localized searching. And if you look on that, shortcut methods, on the container class, right? Containers have children components. As you add them in, there's this method called down, and you give it a selector, like the item ID reference, and it will find the first descendant component of the container which matches that selector, right? So if you're deep in your app, way over here, and you say, hey, my container.down, look for something called severity pull down, it'll look over here for something called for a component called severity pull down using this down method, and you'll see that. That's for relatives. There is a method for doing, I think it's called get CMP, get component by ID for global lookups if you're going down that route. Okay, so as an example, if we, let's take a look at our combo box here. Let's just do some experimenting here. So let's put an ID and call it, call foo XYZ so I can search it later. Okay, and I'll write it. Command 2, Command R. And then using our debug tools, remember this is an ID, a global ID. So if we use our search tool and go up, and I'm going to search somewhere up here. We'll look some code here, and we're looking for foo XYZ. And in fact, if you look here, I just found it by eye, here is ID equals foo XYZ. And that's in the HTML document, it gives it a specific ID, a value. Okay, so Xed has translated that into an ID. Now if I go back to my code and I put item ID, this would be interesting. Command 2, Command R. Let's do our highlight the component up here so we can see where the encoded is. And this happens to be the same iteration combo box, but there's no ID field. And I don't see anything about foo XYZ. In fact, it gave it this generated ID called rally iteration combo box dash 1011. Right, so it generates IDs for you. If you don't give a global ID, it'll make one for you. But this item ID is not there. And what confused me, back to code, was that what I've come to learn, at least as of now, is that item ID is very internal to X. It's just for doing local searching of your components. The ID is something that actually gets translated into the HTML as generated. So that's a really important distinction there. Okay. So how do we use this? Okay. Well, in our app, if you look up on our code, we had two levels of nesting. We have our app, then we have inside of there, we have the horizontal row of pull downs, and we created a pull down container. In fact, that pull down container is right here. So we put a container inside of our container, and in that pull down container, we added an iteration drop-down box and a severity drop-down box. We have two components inside of a container, pull down container inside of our app container. So what I'm going to do very simply is I'm going to create on the pull down container, rather than registering it at the app level, I'm actually going to get rid of that and call it var. So it's, and then I'm going to add an item ID. We'll just call it a pull down container. Okay, you give it a name. It doesn't matter what it is. And then I'm going to say get rid of the this dot because it's no longer part of our app. We're kind of cleaning up our app. We're not shoving a bunch of stuff up in the app level anymore. So we create a local variable instance of the container, where we give it a reference that we can pull out later, and then we add that to our app, the app level itself. So that should work as defined. And then if we go down to the combo box right here, in our iteration, what we were doing here is we were creating the iteration combo box, and at the very end we were saying, hey, by the way, in that pull down container, let's shove ourselves into that pull down container with add, right? Pull down container.add. But rather than getting it off the app, let's do this a little more cleanly. And we'll say this dot, we'll do this dot down. Remember, this is the app, the highest level for us. And we're going to look down in our hierarchy, right? Because we're a container and we can look down in there. And we're going to look for something called pull down container. Let's just do a little quick test here. Var container equals, okay, console.log use down for pull down. Okay, let's just do a quick test. Look at the console for that. Cannot call method add of undefined. Oh, that's because the first line up here no longer isn't valid because we don't have the pull down on the app itself anymore. We got rid of it up above. Okay, just comment it out for now. I'm just kind of playing around here. Okay, use down for the pull down, and guess what? We found something. We found something that has a container, item ID pull down container. Boom, we found it. Okay, that is the container. If I kind of just sniff around a little more here, yeah, we found a container. Okay, but this is the key thing. We found the pull down container. We gave it that name. So now that we have it, let's get rid of our log. Now that we have the reference to the container, we'll say .add. We'll add the this.iter combo box. We're going to have to clean this up too, because we don't want this to be global anymore, but in order to make this work at the moment, I have to do that. Right, because the combo box, we're saying create a combo box into this variable and into the following variable here, and we're saying throw that on the app, attach it to the app. We don't want to do that anymore. We're going to clean that up as well, but for now, let's just make sure we didn't break anything. So we'll keep it globally here, but adding it to a lookup to the pull down. So hopefully this should just work. We haven't broken anything in our refactoring yet. This is line 71 on the right here is where it's breaking. Oh, it's down in severities. Huh. Yeah, okay, so we have to do the same thing. All right, well, let's just copy the code up here. go down here, because we have 2 pull downs. Let's do it to the second pull down so it's happy. This dot down, pull down container, find the container, and add this dot severity combo box. Put the comment there, okay. Let's just go and let's clean this one up because I'm pretty confident it's going to work. Okay, get rid of that, okay. Refresh. And there we go, our app works up above just as expected. Okay, let's fix the actual combo boxes too. So with the combo boxes, we have 2 things going on. One, when we're creating them like at the app level so we can access them later. Well, where do we access them later? And we did that for both the iteration combo box and the severity combo box. Well, it's down in load data when we go sniff out the values. In load data, we said, hey, app level dot iteration combo box, get your record. Well, we're going to have to do our lookup code for the combo box and the lookup code for the severity combo box. Those 2 combo boxes, just like we did for the pull down. So let's do the same thing we do with the container to the combo boxes. Let's add an item ID. Item ID, iteration combo box. Copy that, go down to the severity one. Call this one severity combo box, and we can get rid of the this references. We just do a local variable in the function. Okay, so we create a combo box into a local variable. Once it's created, we'll go and we'll add it. We'll say look up the pull down container and add our instance in the function here, the iteration combo box. We took off the iteration combo box from the top level app, cleaned it up. That's awesome. Same thing for severities. Local variable for the combo box. When we're ready to add it here, we look up the pull down container, which is somewhere next. It finds it for us. And we add our local severity combo box. Command 2, Command R. Cannot call method get record. Oh, yes. So we fixed the layout of things, but down in get load data, we're still referencing the combo boxes at the top level. So what we have to do is the same kind of thing. We have to say, rather than globally looking up an app, we have to look it up. So we say this, which is the app, dot down, look for something called the iteration combo box. Dot get record. Same thing here. So this dot, let's reuse the code here, down, severity combo box. Okay, let's just remind ourselves, right? At the app level container, we're looking down the container hierarchy, looking for something named iteration combo box, which is the name of our combo box. And then we'll get the record that's selected and get the actual value of the ref from there. Same thing with the severity one. And we have to do this relative to the app itself, which is the container, which has the world of things. Here we go. Boom. Didn't break anything. Okay, is there anything else that we're going to cover here? So just in summary, what we've done, I think I'll leave it at this for now, for the ID and item ID, is we've refactored the code to take off, let's see, we refactored the code to take off the pull-down container, the iteration combo box, and the severity combo box away from registering it at the app level. Rather, we said, let's just give them IDs and we'll look them up later. Perfect. Put an item ID in the pull-down container. Go down to the combo box. When we built the combo box, we added that combo box by looking up the pull-down container. No big deal. On the combo boxes, we gave them their own IDs, and we'll look them up when we need them down below, and we have to pull the values out. We did that down here in the loading data. We said, go find the combo box deep in my hierarchy from the app. Look all the way down and find it by name. Okay, so now I want to briefly cover X types. Now we've actually seen this in a number of different places. We just kind of ignored it because this is sort of the shorthand notation, right? We've been using the longhand division for a little while. But if you look here into the iteration combo box docs, there are 2 places where we see X types. One is in the example code and in other components. We've seen examples where they just have this thing called X-type and they give it this name and magically something gets built. And you also notice up in the documentation, all components also have this thing called X-type. Now, truth be told, when the engineers build this whole honkin' object here by full name, they can also just give it a simple basic name, the X-type, widget name, X-type name. Now, there are two things where this comes into play. One is, it's just a shorthand notation, and you'll find it just for quickly adding components in. You don't have to do, like in our examples, in our code, like our pull down that wraps our, or the container that wraps our little pull downs. We did the longhand notation of x.create, we give it the full name, we give it a configuration, and that's how we explicitly create it. X-type lets us shorten that code down. Now, I do want to point out, if you go to docs.cincha.com, and I referenced this in the very first video, you go to their latest docs, we build on the Cincha framework, so anything that they have pertains to the Rally framework as well. If you go to guides, little book up here, and go down to components, there's a lot of great reading here if you want to know about XJS. But regarding components and the hierarchies and stuff, if you scroll down, there's an entire section here on X types and what they call lazy instantiation. So the gist here is that the X type notation tells the framework not to actually like build the component until it's actually referenced or used. So it lets you define your app, and as the user makes their way through, then it'll start to instantiate and build up the components, as opposed to just creating them all at once, even though the user may only use 40% of the app, right? So why waste memory and stuff? Okay. Now, for small things, it's probably not a big deal, but since you'll see this in the code all over the place, as we have, it's important to cover it. So let's get to some code. Let's talk about X types. So we created, let's just do a real simple example, okay? And then in the next section, when we talk about layout, we'll use it for, we have a real example of how to use it. So let's redefine our pull down using X type. Well, all you have to do is create an object. So pull down container, we use the same name. Create a basic JavaScript object and give it X type. Now the question is, what name do you give it? Well, we were creating this x.container.container. So let's go up and look up container. And x.container.container. And along the top we see the full name. On the right we see the X type is just called container. So in our code we put container. And everything else we copy and paste from our above example. It's the same stuff. Okay. And let's actually just get rid of this. Let's actually I want to steal the comments here. Put those up there. Okay, let's just get rid of our explicit definite declaration. So here we create a basic object. It's just name value pairs. There's nothing visual about it at all. This X type will let the X framework know, okay, now go get the thing called a container. And it'll do that when you add this plain old object into this.add. The this.add will go and do all the magic of creating a real bona fide visual object. So let's go command 2, command R, and we should not have broken anything here. Okay, looks good. I think functions as expected. So this is just a way to, another way to specify an object. I'm going to leave it at that, and we're going to use that example coming up next. All right, so let's tackle number 3 of our refactor list, defining the layout in the app itself. What I mean by that is, in our approach so far, as the app was built out, we would create things and add things to the layout sort of as we went along. And there's nothing wrong with that. But one thing I found is that there is a mechanism that allows you to upfront define what I think of as sort of the skeleton of the app, the visual skeleton. I want to get those major pieces in there, right? So think of like the nav, top nav, left nav, content, footer, like that kind of top level layout. I'd like to set that up in advance, so as a reader of the code, you get a sense of what the app's going to look like, as opposed to having to trace code and figure out, which containers were added to which other containers, added these other containers, and when the other components were added, and trying to sniff it out directly. So with that, one example that we saw here was in our combo box. We saw when, in this little very tiny snippet here of code, it said, hey, let's create a basic container. And in that container, we're going to have a property called items, and it's an array of one or more objects. And the object that's here has a name of X type and a value of rally iteration combo box. This is very small amount of code. It does a lot of stuff. This builds an iteration pull down box, right, in the code. Right? If I go live preview, here we go. There's an iteration pull down box with, and this is just like basic X code here. I mean, it's like one line of rally code. It's silly. Anyway, but knowing what we know now, we know that X type is a shorthand notation for building a real full-blown object. So this does something. What's new is that this items property. So let's go look up this items. Now this is a property on the container class. I happen to have the tab open. And under configs, we go down to items. Boom. Items is an array of objects, a single or an array. And so it turns out that when you're defining your container, and keep in mind our app, right, our big app is a container, so it can have items as well. Rather than down in the code saying this.add, 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 and adding individual components as you go, in the items array, you can preload what your app looks like. Well, what is in this array? It says each item in the array can be a component or a component configuration object. If a configuration object is specified, let's think about X types in our head, just as a plain old JavaScript object, the actual type of the component to be instantiated may be indicated by using the X type option. So you put a little name value pair called X type, and then boom, it's going to create a whole full-blown object based on that name for you. Okay? Every component has its own X type. So let's do this. Let's put this in action. So instead of in our launch method creating this pull down thing, let's take this object. Let's create or open our app. Let's create something called items. It's an array. Let's start with that. And in here, we're going to put an object. Let's go grab our pull down code, our plain old object. Let's go grab this guy here and stuff it up in the items. Okay. Now let's put on a new line just for kicks. I'm going to keep my comment. All right, get rid of the semicolon. That doesn't exist in arrays. I'll go down and get rid of our code here. Okay, so what have I done? Well, at the top level of our app, we're creating an items. And at least for now, one thing that's in this app is a container, a generic container called Pulldown Container that has a particular layout. That's it. So so as you're looking at this code, you kind of know, hey, by the way, without even knowing anything down below, we at least have a pull-down container. And because we gave it an item ID, right, from earlier, we can look it up. So let's see here. Now what's going to have to change is in our launch, we're saying here, this.add pulldown container. Well, guess what? Our pulldown container is part of the item array. It's already added. Next, let's get rid of it. Our launch method just went like this. Command 2, Command R. Let's refresh our app and see if anything changed drastically, like getting some major errors. And no, it's all working fine as expected. That's a nice little refactor. Our launch method should be really small, right? We don't want layouts and logic, business logic and stuff. So putting in the items array, that was a nice touch. Now, I won't actually do this to keep it short, but the pull-down container itself, you could go so far as saying, well, this is a container. It also has items, which are an array of what? Well, you could go and put the iteration X type iteration combo box and put another one, which is the I forget the actual name. It's like field value combo box for severity, and go down and get the combo boxes and all their configurations and put them up in here. That might not be a bad idea. I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader, but you can certainly, maybe for this small app, maybe that's worth doing. You know, in fact, heck, let's just do it. Let's go down to our combo boxes, load iterations. Well, let's see. For this video, just really what I want to do, because we could just pull the config objects and slap them up there. I'm a little concerned about the methods here, although we're calling this, which is the app level, and the items is at the app level, so why not? You know, let's just do it. If it breaks, then we learn something. I'm just going to take this whole object, right, everything except for the longhand division, and I'm going to go up here to items of the pull-down container and add it in. Let's just clean up the code a little bit. BIID. And you're going to see why I might not do this in the future, just because it's a lot of code up at the top. But just for the sake of showing this, I think that's the last one. Yeah, okay, so that's the iteration combo box. We should be able to go down to our code. Now, the one thing to be careful about, we can get rid of the longhand, is we don't have, when we load the iterations, it's really going to work. It's funny because we don't even actually have to add this anymore because it's already at the items. I don't know, let's just figure it out. Just reload. Test it. Unexpected identifier. Boom. So no, I don't think this is a good way to do it. Oh, X type, rally, rally iteration combo box. We forgot to put the X type. Iteration combo box. Line 32 syntax. Come on now. Line 30. Oh, comma. Okay, that's fine. Come on, we can do it. We can make it work. Oh, our second app. Object has no method. Load severities. Line 23. Line 23. Load severities. This dot load severities. It doesn't know what load severities is, which means the this reference is all busted. Well, what the heck is this? Well, console.log. What is this? Like this. So in the items array, what does this refer to? What is this? Oh, window. This refers to window, which is the like uber outer level reference. Oh, this isn't going to work. Fudge. Okay, so when the items array is loading, the scope or the context of what this is refers to like the outermost like frame of where this thing is running. So I'm not sure how to change that scope, honestly, and frankly, I think I'm just going to leave this part in the video because it's all part of experimenting and realizing what's going on and debugging. That said, I don't know if I like putting all this business logic way up in the items, right? I mentioned earlier, I like the items. If you're doing skeletal layout, you know, you're not putting event handlers and stuff in. You can register event handlers after the fact. But frankly, I'm going to undo this code. It's just it's too much code up there. Obviously, I couldn't get to work right away. Let's back this out. Okay, there we go. Get rid of that. Go back, make sure you didn't break anything. And let's do a quick review. Yeah, we're fine. So at the end of the day, what we did is at the app level, we created items. It contains one or more things that we want to just add as part of the app. So we don't have to say this.add blah, you know, longhand notation. So we're going to just out of the gates add a container for our pull downs with an item ID, and we'll look that up down below when we're creating our pull downs, and we'll say look up that pull down container and add to it the local component that we created. So let's tackle our number 4 event handling function calls. This one's going to be pretty short. So we'll talk about some naming conventions and some patterns that you'll see in other code. So earlier on, when we were at the Rally Apps GitHub in our app catalog, we went down and we just kind of sniffed out this Kanban board source code. And in the Kanban app.js, we found an example. If I'll search for listeners, here's another good example. This is actually another case of it, another in the same file. So hence the pattern. They create a listeners, and it's and in their listeners, they basically, here's the name of the listener and then the function reference that's going to call. Now in our code, if you go look here, like at our iteration combo box, in our listeners block, when the combo box fetched the data, came back, and was ready to do something, we defined a function. And in fact, if we go, let's go look for ready. Under the events, under ready, notice that this event function for ready would come back with, and would call a function giving it a combo box and some other options. And for other event handlers, you may have 3 or 4 other parameters, right? That you're going to have to define in the function that gets called. So like in our example here, down below, ready function, we would say combo box, some eops, whatever comes back. Maybe there's a list, and other things, there's like lists of records, there's data, there's other things, success flags, right? All sorts of things that come back. Now, so you can jam all that logic inside the definition of the combo box. I don't like to do that. If you look back at the Rally code, they have this real nice, clean, and crisp thing that says, when you register the listener, call a very simple method. So, and all you have to do, you don't have to create the function and all the parameters here. You just have to give it the reference where to call the given function name. And when you look at the function name, like on before create, I'm searching for it, create, the method at the app level is a function, and it defines the parameters as per the spec for the event, and it does the code. But this method is back up at the app level, which is really nice. So let's do a quick refactor of our code. So let's make the code more visible here. Let's do our, this is actually going to work out really nice because we have a lot of calling to the load data method. So on iteration combo box, we have 2 listeners, a ready listener and a select listener. What I'd really like to do is make the code look like ready. When the ready fires, I want us to call this dot on iterations ready. It's another pattern. You'll see naming pattern. And then for select, I'm going to call this dot. Select is calling this dot load data. Now I could say, and I'm not really giving it any information. It's just a generic function call. So I could say on iterations selected, but and then do the logic there. But all I'm really doing is calling one method. So let me just call that method, or give it the method to call, this dot load data. And let's just get rid of this code. Okay. Now I'm giving it a specific name here because I actually want to do something. I actually have to undo and figure out what I was doing with that code. It's called load severities. Let me copy that. So let's go create that method real quick before I get too far ahead of myself. So we're creating at the app level on iterations ready, and it's a function, and the function is going to expect from the ready event 2 parameters, the combo box itself and some eops. I'm just going to give it combo box. I don't care about the eops. I'll put it, whatever. You can print it out later if you're curious what it is. But that's the function that'll be called, giving it those parameters. And based on what we're refactoring, we're calling load severities. Okay, now I can get rid of my code up here that I refactored out. But I do still need to send in scope. so it knows what this is. Okay, so what have we done? Our listeners block got really small. When ready fires, we'll call this onIterationsReady. We created a new method called onIterationsReady that we'll call the load severities. Oh wait, you know what? We're not actually even passing any values. Why don't we just call? Nah, I'll leave it like that. You know, you could just put or this dot load severities. But to be with the pattern of what the Rally engineers use, I'll just show that as an example. You should get the point there. Okay, let's go load severities. Same thing. In this case, they both call load data. Right? Real simple. We actually don't have a lot of logic, so let's just do ready this dot load data. Select, and when it fires, give it have it call a method. We don't want to fire right away, so we're not going to actually invoke it right now, but we just want to say this is the data or the method that you're going to invoke when you're ready. Did I get my commas all fine up here? Iteration, yep. Let's go test it. Alt-R, or Command-2, Command-R. Boom, we haven't broken anything. Awesome. Okay. So that's pretty much the, I don't think we have any other listeners in here. That's what I wanted to cover real quick, is to make these listener blocks nice and tight. If you just are if you're calling a simple method, in fact, if you're reusing a method, right? In this case, we're using load data many times. This is really nice, right? We're not creating anonymous functions just because. And you don't have to specify parameters or anything, because you're telling the app to call this function, and when you do, it'll give the right parameters at runtime. And in fact, you know, just for kicks, I'm going to even make this. Let's just call this one what it is. Let's just say this dot load severities. We're not calling the function; we're just giving it a reference. Let's just get rid of this. Refresh. Okay. So for the sake of this video, I'm just going to say, you know what? Let's just try and keep our listeners nice and tight. If you do have logic, sticking down in other methods and call those methods, it makes it really easy to, much easier to test and much easier to read, obviously, in the code. And last but not least, let's tackle number 5, scope me. So there's a pattern that you'll see in code. In an attempt to provide some sanity to the this variable and using this all over the place, nested in deep levels, and wondering what the heck does it point to, there's a very common pattern you'll see where in code they'll create a variable called me. There's a couple other variants, but let's just use me as the classic example, I guess. And they'll say var me equals this. So at that particular point in time, whatever this variable refers to is what the me will point to. Okay, this will change depending on where it is deep in the code and the context of when it runs, but me refers to what it points to at that moment in time. So to give an example, I was actually out surfing the Rally community portal, and there are a lot of great apps out here, even connectors, not even just apps, but there's one called Feature Map. And Feature Map was written by Colin O'Brien, one of our rockstar coders here in the technical account management group at Rally. But if we go look in his source code for this, app.js, if I just do Command F var me search, there are 1 of 13 references. So he's a big fan of this pattern as well. And so you can see here there's some method, doesn't matter, on our app called showLegend, and it defines a function. So whenever you call showLegend, it'll execute this function. And you can see here var me equals this. Go down and see here's another case, a function called add content. He says var me equals this. I'll do one more on scope change. Right? It doesn't matter what we're doing in the code, but you can see this pattern of var me equal this. Well, and then once you have it, and here's a good data, like in his load data, whatever he's doing, he references var me, and then down in the listeners block of his store, right? And we're familiar with stores. We're familiar with creating stores. We're familiar with listeners. We're familiar with passing scope in so that when the listener function fires, it has reference to something, which is the app. Well, we were passing this, but what he does is he passes me. Now, what does it mean to pass in me? Well, it's really, for me, personally, capital me, as if this wasn't confusing enough. For me personally, in Rally app development, you define this me variable at the top level context, and you refer it to the app. So at any point in your code, when you see the reference of me, what it means is it's pointing to the app. So in this sea of this variables and referencing who knows what, you just know me refers to the app. Now, why don't you call it var app equal this? That might be what I would do. But me sort of has this tradition in JavaScript lore, and so that's what you'll see. So let's go ahead and, so at the end of the day, it's just a pattern for, at least for me, it's a pattern to create some sanity and know that whenever I see me, I'm pointing to my app. I could create me variables deep nested below. I'm just not going to do it. There's no value in that. I'll use the this variable down below. Okay, so in our code, what we're going to do is let's do load iterations, right? So in our code, our launch method fires, we call load iterations. Let's just follow the pattern. Var me equal this. And let's just print out dot me. What is the me variable? Command R, command 2, command R. It's fine. So got me, and it's an object. We'll go down to the proto, which I like to do. And me points to custom app, right? What is custom app? Scroll to the top of your code. Happens to be the name of your particular app. Okay. So me is the app. So down in the code, when I create my combo box and I pass in scope, now me and this in this particular example, they're completely identical in this entire example. So I'm going to put me here in all the cases. Okay. Doesn't change the code at all, or the execution of the code. But what it starts to turn your mind on to is that whenever you see me, it refers to the app. Okay, same thing here. Me refers to the app. I don't have to worry what does this point to because what I'm passing in is me. And when the events call, it's going to call those methods on me. Me, the app. No need for me there. You could do it here just to be consistent and load data. So just create it at the top and we'll look in the code. I see this down below, so we'll probably use it. Var me equal this. So down here we say if like me.defectStore, me.store. So we're kind of just replacing. Now here's where it's going to get interesting. Now we're nesting. That's where it's going to get interesting. So we're going to create this store, and then we're going to create some listeners, and we want to pass in me. I'm going to leave it like that. Let's just see. Command 2, command. Let's see how much we broke. Nothing. Great. Something must be wrong. That's cool. So let's see. When our store, so where the heck am I? I'm in load. I'm in load data. We're at the point we're going to get some data. Create some filters. Okay, let's create a store and go query data with our filters. Create defects with our filters or listeners. Now, when we load, can I put me in here? What is me? It doesn't exist. Me variable. I suspect it might. It does. What is me? Me refers to custom app. So you could, in fact, replace the this's with me. Okay. Same here. Just be complete. Just because we're consistent in our code. So this is actually a fairly, everything's at the top level, so make sure we didn't break anything. So one of the reasons I point this out is you'll see the me reference. It's nothing more than a pattern for me, when you're looking through code, that you start to see that if you're looking deep in code, like you're just looking at this block right here, right? You're deep nested, and you're like, what the heck is this thing doing, right? Let's actually get rid of me.createGrid. This just tells me instantly that's at the app level. I don't have to worry about, well, this magical variable, what the heck is that reference to? So it's kind of a neat little pattern. I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, so for a quick review, I'm going to take 1 minute and walk through the code. But in this session, we refactored the query filters. We learned about ext IDs and item IDs, talked about the items array and defining components in the layout. Up above in the app, talked about some nice conventions for event handlers and also the convention of using the me variable. In our code, if we look at it from the top, if I were to build an app today, this is what it might look like. If I knew what the general layout would look like, I'll create an items array at the top. I'll create some configuration objects with the X type, and I'll give it an item ID that so I can look it up later. And I'll probably even give it some basic configuration for how I want to look or lay out. But I want to keep this small. For each configuration, I want to keep it small, and for the list of items, I want to keep that reasonable. I don't want to define my entire app and all the logic up there. It's just meant to tell, for me, it's meant to tell a short story of the app. In our launch method, we talked about using the me reference to refer to the app as just a convention. We call load iterations. In load iterations, we create a combo box, a local instance of the combo box in full explicit notation. We give it an item ID so we can look up the value later that the user chooses. In our listeners block, we created a real nice tight list of listeners, with just the name of the listener and the method, a reference or a pointer to the function that will be called. We're not we're not putting our logic there anymore. And then when we create the combo box, we're going to look up with the ID, the item ID, sorry, the pull-down container. And once we have a reference to the pull-down container, we'll add the local instance of the combo box. So we have our outer app. We pre-registered a pull-down container. And now that we've looked this up in this particular code, we've added our iteration combo box to it. Once our iteration combo box is ready, we called load severities. Load severities did the same things, created a combo box with an item ID to look up later, has its listeners all set up, and when it was, after we created it, we looked up the pull-down container. From the app, we looked down the hierarchy, finding the pull-down container, adding to the pull-down container this particular combo box. And then we also refactored out the filters. We used the Wasapi filter object so that we could create multiple filters and then control the and or logic of how we want to build those up. And the toString method on those was helpful for debugging. In load data, we still pull out the values from the combo boxes, but this time we look them up, right? We're not going after the app and sort of managing registering ourselves. We're saying, hey, look, let's use ext. So at the app level, because it's a container, an ext container, we have the down method. It says look down your hierarchy, looking for something, a component called, or with an item ID called iteration combo box, and then we can call the methods on that. Let's see here, what else did we do? We also use the me variable in various places here. So even deep nested code, when you see the me reference, it just knows you're at the app level. I know this method called createGrid is at the app level because of the me reference. Nice convention. Okay. So if you have any questions, keep in mind there's the Stack Overflow, where all of our community uses to answer questions. Look up answers to questions that may have already been answered. And that is it for today. This is a long session, but again, back to our purpose, right? And our acceptance criteria. I don't know if I'm going to do another session on grids here, but we talked about where to find existing apps in GitHub and the 3 repositories. We've used the SDK and API docs a lot in terms of where to find help and resources. Starting a new app, like into this, when we started this app today, we pulled the code out of GitHub and got going, right? Comfortable trying, failing, debugging, and learning. We've been doing a lot of coding, tripping up a lot, getting stuff fixed, using debugging. That's why these sessions are long. This one bullet, number 4, is the one that, at heart for me, is why I did these videos. I want people to feel like you're not trying to climb, the El Capitan straight face rock wall for 2 days to get to the top. I want this to be like a hike, right? You might trip and stumble, but you'll get back up. You have the right tools in your tool belt, right? You get a cut or a scrape, you fix yourself up, and you keep moving on. And that's what this whole session is about for me. And then lastly, now that you're comfortable with scope, you're comfortable with X types, you're comfortable with JavaScript, right? We've seen 7 or 8 or 9 different patterns. Now that you start looking at other people's code, looking at the API and the SDK documentation, this stuff should not be foreign to you. You might have to jog your memory a little bit, but navigating the API and the SDKs is like, yeah, you can get there and get through it. They're all there. This has been long, but it's been fun. I'm really happy I feel like I've satisfied the acceptance criteria. I hope you have felt that way too. If you don't, please let me know. But I'm really excited that in the last 3 videos we took this really simple grid and we dialed in some really good practices and made a nice, really nice tight app. Most importantly, we've learned some patterns and practices that you're going to use when you start building additional apps on our platform and you realize the possibilities of what's available to you. Happy coding.